Well, good morning. I'm glad you're here today. As I've said on numerous occasions, we may have a very small church, but we have a very talented church. Thank you, Brian. And as Tom mentioned, you didn't pick a very simple subject in the Bible to deal with. It's very complicated, and some very bright men, frankly, can get it wrong. So I really appreciate how you explained that. Just a few announcements. Women's Bible Study Tuesday, 7 p.m. at the Stacy's, unless otherwise updated. No men's Bible study this week. Andy and Sarah are serving at Youth Summit weekend at Shiloh Bible Camp, March 20th to the 22nd. Please speak with Sarah if you're interested in serving there as well. And please encourage any junior high kids in your life to attend. And of course, no prayer meeting tonight, which means following the service we'll need to put the chairs up when we're finished today. Our scripture reading is Ezekiel chapter 32. Ezekiel chapter 32. In the 12th year, in the 12th month, in the first of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, You compare yourself to a young lion of nations, yet you are like the monster in the seas, and you burst forth in your rivers, and muddy the waters with your feet, and foul the rivers. Thus says the Lord God, Now I will spread my net over you, with the company of my peoples, and they shall lift you up in my net. And I will leave you on the land, and will cast you on the open field, and I will cause all the birds of the heavens to dwell on you, and I will satisfy the beasts of the whole earth with you. I will lay your flesh on the mountains. I will fill the valleys with your refuse. I will also make the land drink the discharge of your blood as far as the mountains, and the ravens will be full of you. And when I extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun and cloud and the cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you, and I will set darkness on your land, declares the Lord God. I will also trouble the hearts of many peoples when I bring your destruction among the nations into lands which you have not known. I will make many peoples appalled at you, and their kings will be horribly afraid of you when I brandish my sword before them, and they will tremble every moment, every man for his own life on the day of your fall. For thus says the Lord God, The sword of the king of Babylon will come upon you, by the swords of the mighty ones. I will cause your lords to fall. All of them are tyrants of the nations, and they will devastate the pride of Egypt, and all its lords will be destroyed. And I will destroy all its cattle from the side of many waters, and the foot of man will not muddy them anymore, and the hooves of beasts will not muddy them. Then I will make their waters settle, and will cause the rivers to run like oil, declares the Lord God. When I make the land of Egypt a desolation, the land is destitute of that which filled it, when I smite all those who live in it, then they shall know that I am the Lord. This is the lamentation, and they shall chant it. The daughters of the nations shall chant it over Egypt, and over the hordes they shall chant it, declares the Lord God. In the 12th year, on the 15th of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, wail for the hordes of Egypt, and bring it down, her and her daughters, and the powerful nations, to the nether world, with those who go down to the pit. Whom do you surpass in beauty? Go down and make your bed with the uncircumcised. They shall fall in the midst of those who are slain by the sword. She is given over to the sword. They have drawn her and all the hordes away. The strong among the mighty ones shall speak of him and his helpers from the midst of Sheol. They have gone down, they lie still, the uncircumcised slain by the sword. Assyria is there, and all her company. Her graves are round about her, and all of them are slain, fallen by the sword, whose graves are set in the lowest parts of the pit, and her company is round about her grave. All of them are slain, fallen by the sword, who spread terror in the land of the living. Elam is there, and all their hordes around her grave. All of them slain by the fallen sword, who went down uncircumcised by the lower parts of the earth, and instilled their terror in the land of the living, bore their disgrace with those who went down to the pit. They have made a bed for her among the slain with all her wards. Her graves are around it. They are all uncircumcised, slain by the sword, although their terror is instilled in the land of the living. And they bore their disgrace with those who go down to the pit. They were put in the midst of the slain. Meshach and Tubal and all their hordes are there. Their graves surround them. All of them were slain by the sword, uncircumcised, though they instilled their terror in the land of the living. Nor did they lie beside the fallen heroes of the uncircumcised who went down to Sheol with their weapons of war, and their swords were laid under their heads. But the punishment for their iniquity rested on their bones. For the terror of these heroes was once in the land of the living. But in the midst of the uncircumcised, you will be broken and lie with those slain by the sword. There also is Edom, its kings and all its princes, who for all their might are laid with those slain by the sword. They will lie with the uncircumcised and with those who go down to the pit. They also are the chiefs of the north, all of them, and all the Syrians, who, in spite of the terror resulting from their might, in shame went down with the slain. So they lay down uncircumcised with those slain by the sword, and bore the disgrace with those who go down in the pit. These Pharaoh will see, and he will be comforted for all his hordes slain by the sword. Even Pharaoh and all his army declares the Lord God. Though I instill terror of him in the land of the living, yet he will be made to lie down among the uncircumcised, along with those slain by the sword. Even Pharaoh and all his hordes declares the Lord God. Bill, you and Mr. Perkins.
Father in heaven, we thank you for this time you've given us, and we pray for those around us that haven't accepted Christ, that you will accept Jesus as your Savior, so they don't have to experience the second death. We pray that you will continue to watch over us. We pray for this country that we do not go to extremes. We understand that this is a spiritual battle. Satan is having a good time with this country at this point. Pray that believers will lead the way for those around us and get us through these times. And we also thank you for bringing Andy back safely, and we pray that Mark Musser, that he will be able to get out of Ukraine and get back to Armenia. Yes, this is Jesus.
All right. If you take your hymnals and turn to hymn number 312, hymn number 312. Let's go ahead and stay seated. Let's listen to the first verse and let's prepare our worship. One second now. Hymn number 312. hymn number 40. Hymn number 40, To God be the glory. Start right with the music, and let's go ahead and sing all 3 verses. Hymn number 40, To God be the glory.
Sit there, Tiger. 40 years ago, during the Winter Olympics, the U.S. hockey team defeated the Russian hockey team in what is called the greatest upset in sports history. The American hockey team was comprised of young college kids. The Russian team was a professional team. Most of the players on the Russian team were 10, 15, or even 20 years older than the kids that played for the U.S. The coach for the U.S. team was a guy named Herb Brooks, who was a Christian man, and he basically handpicked the U.S. team, and he pushed them really hard. In fact, they played 60 games before the Winter Olympics, and they were probably the best conditioned team to ever play in hockey anywhere. They were better than anybody in the final period. Before the game with Russia, Coach Brooks looked around the room at each member of the team who he had chosen, and he said, "You are meant to be here. You were born for a time like this." Here's the call by Al Michaels, the iconic call in the 1980 games. The U.S. hockey victory that year in 1980 helped restore pride in this country, pride in America. And today, we're going to study somebody who saved an entire nation. And the Bible said this person was born for such a time as this. And of course, I'm talking about Esther. And as we study today, our key point, the big idea, is that each of us are born for such a time as this. God put us here at this time and at this place for a reason. He could have placed us any time in history, could have placed us any place else, but he placed us here and now for a reason. A little background on Esther and the book of Esther specifically. Esther is one of two books in the Bible named after a woman. The other one, of course, is Ruth. Esther is one of two books where God is not mentioned directly. The other book is Solomon. But God's providence is more evident probably in the book of Esther than it may be in any other book. Providence, by the way, we use that word a lot in this church. It basically means provide in advance, or God's hand in history. God promoted Esther to save the nation of Israel. Esther became queen of the Persian Empire, and her husband was King Xerxes. Persia, in the time of Esther, ruled most of the known world. They were from India all the way over to Africa, Ethiopia, Turkey, later picked up Greece. Xerxes, by the way, is an interesting character in history. I think Brian's put his picture up on the board. But he was a military genius. He built the largest army and the largest navy that the world had ever seen. He was an emotional guy. One time when he lost 400 ships in a violent storm, it is said he took off his belt on his boat and just slapped the water, screaming and cursing. He was also compassionate. One time when 100,000 troops walked by him, he started crying, and he said, while he was weeping, "I know all this military glory is just for a moment and will fade away. In 100 years, every one of these soldiers is going to be dead, and so am I, and we will not be remembered." Xerxes, while conquering Greece, was stopped in a mountain pass by 300 Spartan Greek soldiers. And that particular battle is featured in a movie called The 300. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. All right, that's Xerxes as he's portrayed in that movie. These 300 guys ended up resisting Xerxes long enough to allow the rest of the Greek people to escape, so that when he arrived in Greece, on the mainland of Greece, everybody had gone and they were all on islands outside the mainland. It's a really good movie, by the way, and very well done. Some theologians, liberal theologians, claim that the book of Esther is false. They claim that it's a story, it's a myth. Legendary fiction is what I read while I was studying this. But the history contained in this book is supported throughout all sorts of, well, I'll give you a couple specific examples. There's specific dates in the book that line up historically. Persian life is described in the book very clearly. Palace and court, the palace and the court are described. The palace etiquette's described, banquet customs described and outlined. And all of it, there was an archaeological excavation of Susa, which was the capital of the winter capital of Persia, and it confirmed much of what Esther has written for us. All right, so there's four main characters in the book of Esther. Number one, we've already met, Xerxes. The second one is Esther. There she is. Esther was a Jew. Her parents died during the Babylonian captivity and invasion. The Bible said she was stunningly gorgeous, and we find out, of course, in our study today that she was also brave and smart. Mordecai is the third character in the book of Esther. Mordecai is Esther's older cousin, and he adopted Esther after her parents were killed. Mordecai is a devout Jew. And then Haman is the fourth character in the book of Esther. Haman at this time was the prime minister of Persia. He was Xerxes' right-hand man. He was second in charge. He took over the country when Xerxes was out battling. Haman was from the Amalekite nation, which hated Jews and hated Israel. Haman was anti-Semitic. He was really the Hitler of his day, and his goal was to kill all the Jews. The Amalekites, by the way, if you've been coming to church here on a regular basis, as most of you have, we've been studying them several times in the past few months here in this church. They were an ancient tribe and nation from the time of Abraham, and they attacked the Jews as the Jews were leaving Egypt. The men and military personnel were in the front. When the Jews left Egypt, they say there was probably 2 or 3 million of them. And in the back were women and children, and the Amalekites came up from behind and killed many of the Jewish women and children before the soldiers were able to surround them. So God promised, in fact, let's go to that. That's our first verse today. Exodus 17:14. God promised to wipe out the Amalekites. He was not going to forget what they had done to the Jews as they were leaving Egypt. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, the Lord says to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalekites from under heaven." The Amalekites attacked the Jews repeatedly in the Old Testament throughout history, during the 40 years in the wilderness. And in other times, as I was studying it, there's at least 6 times that the Amalekites are mentioned in the Old Testament as attacking the Jews. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, we learned that they kidnapped and grabbed David's wives and kids, and David had to go get those back. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 30. And you could probably remember also that King Saul defeated the Amalekites, and he was told by God to kill them all, to confirm what God had promised in chapter 17, verse 14 of Exodus that we just read. But Saul disobeyed, and he didn't kill all the Amalekites. He kept the king, Agag, and most of his family alive. And Haman, by the way, this guy, was a descendant of King Agag. So he was raised to hate the Jews. All right, let's get into the story of Esther. How did Esther become queen? Well, it all started with a big party, a wild party that Xerxes threw. And you could probably turn to Esther now, because we'll start looking at a verse or two there. But Xerxes was preparing to invade Greece, and he wanted his generals in a good mood, so he threw a big party. This party lasted for several weeks. And the Bible says the wine and the beer were served in golden goblets, and Xerxes got a little liquored up, and he sent for his wife, the queen, to show her off in front of his buddies, the generals, and others. And the queen refused to go. And Xerxes was very angry, and he consults with his advisors about what to do with the queen. And the advisors are very worried. They say if the queen isn't punished, other women will rebel also. And I put up the verse, you can look at it if you want, in Esther chapter 1, 17 and 18. This is from the Message Bible, and basically says, and which I think is very clearly says, these are the advisors talking to the king. The word's going to get out. Did you hear the latest about Queen Vashti? King Xerxes ordered her to be brought before him, and she wouldn't do it. When women hear it, they'll start treating their husbands with contempt. The day the wives of Persia officials get wind of the queen's insolence, they'll be out of control. Is that what we want? A country of angry women who don't know their place. So, to avoid the first feminist revolution, the queen was banished from the throne. There was a divorce, and a nationwide search began for the new queen. And that actually turned out to be a 4-year search, and it was nationwide. People participated from all over, and during this 4-year period, by the way, Xerxes was gone with his army. He marched against Greece and eventually took over that country. But Esther was a great beauty that we talked about, and she wins this competition. Xerxes selects her as the next queen. Mordecai, basically her adopted father and cousin, tells her not to tell Xerxes that she's a Jew. And he meets with Esther every single day at the palace. And he makes an important discovery one day. Mordecai, after meeting with Esther, overheard 2 generals conspiring to kill Xerxes. They were putting together a plot to assassinate the king. And Mordecai informed Esther, who tells her husband Xerxes, the plot's confirmed and these generals are hung for doing this. Now, during this whole time, Haman, who's a guy that we'll find out is consumed with arrogance, he insists that everybody must bow down to him. And Mordecai refuses. There's no way, by the way, that a Jew would ever bow down to a Amalekite. So Haman cooks up a scheme to kill all the Jews because he's so angry at what Mordecai is doing. And what's he tell Xerxes? Let's go to Esther chapter 3, verse 8 and 9. Interesting how he puts it to Xerxes. And he says to Xerxes, Haman says to Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom whose customs are different. Isn't that interesting? He says they're different from those of the other people and who do not obey the king's law. There was only one law they weren't obeying. They weren't bowing down to Mordecai. Is it not in the king's best interest to tolerate them? And then verse 9, if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. By the way, 10,000 talents of silver at that time was $200 million. A lot of money. Xerxes, probably exhausted from his 3-year campaign and war, and then an assassination threat or attempt on his life, signs this edict without really questioning Haman, who he trusts. And there's 2 lessons that we learn from this. One, choose your friends, or as the young people like Ryan call them, your influencers, wisely. The Bible's got a lot to say about friendship. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 21, it says, bad company corrupts good morals and good character. In Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6, it says you're not going to have very many friends, but you want to have reliable friends. They're going to be hard to find, but if you find them, you're blessed. Chapter 17, Proverbs chapter 17 says reliable friends go with you through thick and thin. Another good verse, it's not far from here. Why don't we turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 4. So it's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. The Bible has a lot to say about friendship. Friendship's an important thing. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, we'll just read 2 quick verses about friendship. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. All right, chapter 4, verse 9. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their work. And this is important. Verse 10, if one falls down, his friends can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Pretty self-explanatory. I read the Wall Street Journal occasionally. They have really interesting articles, and there's an article last week about friendship. And studies show that friendship literally improves your body's cardiovascular functions, how your immune system works, and how you sleep. You can imagine the food you put in the body can make you healthy or not. But sitting in a coffee shop with someone and just chatting about what's going on in your life, we always thought emotionally that made you feel good, but it's really doing much more. Study at Harvard of men across their lives from 20 to 80 found that the single best predictor of your health and happiness at age 80 was not your wealth or your professional success, it was your relationships and friendships. Interesting. All right, the second lesson we learned from Haman and getting the edict signed to kill all the Jews is that Satan's goal is to destroy the Jewish race. And he wants to do this basically because God promised to preserve the Jewish race, and if he can destroy the Jews, he makes God a liar. That promise, by the way, is in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, where God told Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and I'll bless anybody who helps you, and I'll curse anybody who curses you. We'll see, by the way, that Haman ends up getting cursed. All attempts to exterminate the Jews throughout history have been thwarted by God and his people. But it's always good, I think, for us in this day and age to be aware of anti-Semitism because it is satanic. And certainly it's prevalent here in our community in Olympia. A few years ago, the Olympia Food Co-op boycotted all goods from the nation of Israel. That was tested and tried in food co-ops throughout the country, San Francisco, New York City, Los Angeles. But Olympia is the only one where it actually was imposed, and it's still imposed to this day. Evergreen State, you guys know about that. Our pastor and founding member of this church went there. The only good thing to ever come out of there, maybe. But that college has a Palestinian program where they send kids to the Middle East to help the Palestinians in their, quote, fight, unquote, against the Jews. You might remember Rachel Corrie. She's probably one of the most famous people in that program. And sadly and tragically, she tried to stand in front of a bulldozer and was killed and won some worldwide fame for that. But again, an organization, in my opinion, that is certainly not comfortable with Jews. Haman, I think, would be comfortable, by the way, in Olympia. By the way, side note too, God condemns internationalism. This is a side note. I was thinking about it recently because of what's happening in the world. But internationalism is basically the effort to get one world leader or one nation in charge. God supports nationalism. In other words, he wants many independent nations. And one of the reasons he does that is because it's easier for Satan to corrupt one big nation than it is for him to focus on 300 separate nations, and easier for him to impose anti-Semitism in one big country than it is to attack thousands or hundreds of countries. During the time of Persia and the time of Esther, there was basically only one country in the world, and it was Persia. And so Satan, of course, focused on imposing a Jewish Holocaust in that country of Persia. All right, let's go back to the story. Mordecai learns of the edict to kill all the Jews, and he tells Esther she's got to stop it. He asked her to go see the king. Now, there was a rule in the Persian kingdom that if anybody came to see the king and they had not been summoned by the king, they would be put to death. So Esther tells Mordecai that, and Mordecai tells her, back to Esther, Esther chapter 4, verse 14. And we'll just look at the last part of that verse. So verse 14 of chapter 4, Mordecai says to Esther, and who knows but that you have become to the royal position for such a time as this. And so have we. That's the big idea for today. Not only was that true for Esther, she was in the right time and right place, but we're in the right time and right place, and we're here for a reason. Esther questions like we do. She says, what can I do? Who am I that God's going to use me? And Haman keeps encouraging her, and basically he tells her, and Brian, you can put that principle up on the board, serving the Lord isn't really about capability, it's about availability. So whatever calling we have to decide whether to do it or not. Esther prays about what to do for 3 days. Again, good thing to do. If you're making a big decision in your life, prayer is very helpful and certainly something to do before you have that decision. And in verse 16, she bravely says, I'll go ahead and go see the king, and if I die, I die. Well, obviously the prayers were answered. She went in to see King Xerxes. He accepted her right away. And he says, what's your request? And she says, I'll tell you at a party that I'm going to throw tomorrow. And she also invites this guy Haman, who then goes out and brags to everybody. He tells all his family and his friends, he says, I've got money, I've got power, and now I'm going to go to an exclusive party. I've got invited to a party. That night, Xerxes can't sleep. Now, maybe he was excited about the party that Esther was going to throw for him. So he orders a reading of the records of his reign. I guess that would put him to sleep. But anyway, by chance, and really nothing's by chance, it was by God's providence, again, God's hand in history. As the servant's reading, he reads about Mordecai uncovering the conspiracy and the plot to assassinate that we talked about a few minutes ago. And Xerxes says to the servant, what did we ever do for this guy? You saved my life. And the servant said, we didn't really do anything for him. At this exact moment, again, the timing of God is perfect, Haman arrives, and Xerxes asked him, what should the king give to a man he really wants to honor? Let's go to Esther chapter 6, verse 6. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Keep reading. Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So Haman thinks the king's talking about him. Haman's an arrogant guy. And we think, Brian, you throw the... I've learned that there's 3 stages of arrogance. There's a stage where you justify things, and the next stage where you deceive yourself, and then the stage where you're self-absorbed. And Haman, frankly, is at that self-absorbed stage where all you can think about is yourself. I truly believe, by the way, that pride and arrogance is the chief source of mankind's woes and mankind's pain. What's the opposite of pain? What's the opposite of pride? We learn about this in Andy talks about this. I think the opposite of pride or arrogance is serving others. And Andy always says you should look for opportunities to serve others. And I think most people in this church do that. And anyway, I'm convinced, by the way, that Satan's goal is to isolate people and get them to think only about themselves. This coronavirus is right out of his playbook. You keep people from interacting with each other, you close down churches, you close down schools, get rid of all sporting events, and everybody's just focused on themselves and they're self-absorbed. The Bible clearly promises happiness for those who get their eyes off of self and focus on other people and help others. And during this, I guess it's a crisis now, certainly a panic, I think believers must always claim the promises of God. Let's look at one of those promises I got on my mind. Go to Isaiah chapter 49. Isaiah 49. God gives us promises to help us through situations like we're living in right now. And this is a promise you can claim for your life that should give you comfort. In Isaiah chapter 49, verse 16, God says to us, I have engraved you on the palms of my hand. Your walls are ever before me. And basically saying he has you in his hands. And in John chapter 10, verse 28, the verse says, God says, no one can pluck you out of my hand. And I think that should give us comfort. God's going to protect us and guard us, and it should free us up to think not really about ourselves, but about others, and to hopefully help them through this particular crisis or panic. You know, giving up freedom for security is usually wrong. It doesn't usually work. In fact, the more power we give to government, the less importance we seem to give to God. Anyway, all right, back to Haman. The self-absorbed prime minister. Go back to Esther. We read Esther 6:6. Haman asked him. Haman thinks the king's talking about him, and he says, "What should we do for somebody that I want to honor?" So Haman says, "Well, let's give." Thinking that Xerxes talking about him, he says, "Well, let's give the man a robe and a crown and parade him through the city on one of your horses, led by your noble prince." And the king says, "Okay, go do this for Mordecai." See verse 10. Chapter 6:10. "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you've recommended." And I think you could probably imagine how humiliated Haman was. He hated Mordecai, and now he's got to lead him through the city, his sworn enemy, on a horse. And Haman, by the way, I think probably at that time must have known that the gig was up and he was probably not going to be able to kill Mordecai and all the Jews. Anyway, next night, Esther's party occurs. And at the party, she asked Xerxes, "Please spare me and my people." Flip to chapter 7, verse 5. And Xerxes responds to Queen Esther after she tells him, "There's somebody that wants to kill me and wants to kill all my people." And the king says to Queen Esther in verse 5, "Who is he? Where is this man who has dared to do such a thing?" And in verse 6, Esther responds, and she says, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." So, if you read on there, Xerxes leaves in a rage. He's really upset. Obviously, he's been deceived by his right-hand man, the guy that he thought was his friend. And Haman, during this time, when Xerxes is out of the room trying to compose himself, Haman begs Esther for his life. And he's probably drunk, actually, but he begs Esther to save him, and he falls into her lap right when Xerxes returns. And this irritates and incites Xerxes even more. And he says, "Are you trying to bless the queen right in front of me, right in my home?" And Xerxes orders Haman to be hung. And the story goes on. He gives Mordecai and Esther Haman's entire estate. We don't know what that was worth, but we know it was worth at least $200 million. And then he gives Mordecai. Mordecai becomes the prime minister of Persia. The Jewish nation is preserved. Not one Jew died as Esther fulfilled the plan that God had for her. She was born for such a time as that. She became queen in order to save her nation. Every year, by the way, the Jews celebrate Esther and celebrate the fact that she saved the nation. They have a festival they call it Purim, P-U-R-I-M. And it's 2 days basically of feasting and eating and giving gifts to each other. This year, the Purim celebration occurred just last week on March 9th and 10th. We call it the Jewish Mardi Gras. An interesting fact, actually, Mark would appreciate this and probably knows it already, but in March of 1945, as World War II was winding down and the Americans had basically overrun the Germans, there were several Jewish military officers who celebrated Purim at Joseph Goebbels' castle in Germany. Goebbels is Hitler's general who tried to exterminate the Jews. Imagine the irony of parents civil services in that one with history report of these Jewish soldiers read out loud what the professor in Goebbels' castle. All right, let's go to principles and application. Xerxes may have ruled the world, but Esther, just one believer, influenced him and impacted the nation. The bottom line is Christ controls history. No matter what happens, Christ is in charge. Look, I got two more verses for you. Let's go to Proverbs 21:1. We worry about things sometimes we shouldn't worry about. God's got it in control. Who knows what's going to happen in the 2020 election? God does. Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a water course wherever he pleases. And that should give you comfort as well. Basically, God doesn't want us to worry. Think about this as a parent. I know several of you are parents. One of the things as a parent that you do not want your kids to worry or live in fear. And you think about that in the context of God. God doesn't want his children to worry or live in fear. Just like as a parent, you don't want your kids to live in fear. Second principle, we already talked about it, the Jews are going to survive. Be careful and aware of anti-Semitism. Third principle, choose your friends and influencers wisely. We went through a few verses about that are important. And then the fourth and final principle, if we're available, God will place us in a position and in the right time, in the right place, where we can be used. I love this poem by the pastor who wrote it. You may not choose the battlefield, God does that for you, but you can find the colors where the colors never flew. The purpose of learning Bible doctrine and coming to a church like this week after week is not really to become a Bible scholar, but to learn what God's plan is for you, and to learn how to live, and to learn how to love others, and to learn how to love God. And as you grow older, our heart, as we learn, doesn't age because we're constantly learning what God wants us to do. And when you put it all together, life can become very, very wonderful. This is our closing verse, 2 Corinthians. Look to the New Testament, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, which talks about as you're growing in grace, you don't really change in your heart. Second Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. All right, therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. Basically that verse says that every day should become a mini adventure to us. Every day, even during days like this, where it appears the country is shutting down and everyone seems to be panicking, we should be joyful. Now, we may not save a nation like Esther did, but at a time like this, we can have an impact on our friends, our family, our neighbors, our co-workers, and that impact can be by demonstrating faith, not fear, during this time. All right, let's close up with a word of prayer, and then we'll do a closing song. Dear God, we're very thankful today for this church and for this community of believers. We're thankful for Esther and what she says to us, that we should have faith and not fear, particularly at trying times like this. Thank you for holding us in your hands and protecting us from every
closing hymn today is hymn number 1.